Welcome to the Visible Art of Translation podcasts. This series of podcasts are part of the EU-funded INCREC project. Our focus is creativity, translation and technology in literary and audiovisual translation. Our goal with this series is to give visibility to the often invisible skills, role and voice of professional translators.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks so much for being here and sitting down with us today for the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. Great to speak to you.
Sarah Timmer Harvey is a translator and writer currently based in Woodstock, New York. She holds an MFA from Columbia University and a BA from Southern Cross University. Sarah's translation of Jente Postuma's novel, What I'd Rather Not Think About, was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize in 2024. In that same year, she published a translation of Thistle, a novel by Nadia de Vries. She's also translated Reconstruction, stories written by the Dutch-Surinamese writer Karin Amat-Moukrim. In the coming year, Sarah's translation of Jente Postuma's critically acclaimed debut, People with No Charisma, will be published. And she's also translated a lot of Dutch-language poetry and fiction in different reviews, magazines, and elsewhere. Born in Australia, Sarah lived and worked in the Netherlands for 14 years before moving to New York City in 2013. So I wanted to start the podcast by asking how you came to be a translator. How did you come to translation?
Well, that's a good question. I didn't, translation wasn't what I always imagined myself doing. It kind of came to me rather than me coming to it. I actually always wanted to be a writer. And, I published a little bit. I always, beside my work, was writing fiction, writing poetry. And my big dream was to do an MFA in fiction. But at the time in my 20s, and I was living in the Netherlands, and it wasn't really a thing. So I kind of had to put that dream aside. And I think while I was working, I think I was always translating. People were always asking me to translate things. So I think when I moved to the US and started my MFA, I actually ended up choosing an MFA in New York that has a really incredible dual track translation program alongside the MFA in fiction. And it's headed by the translator Susan Banowski. And I thought, well, I'm going to do this dual track just to keep my connection to Dutch literature, to language, and just because I'm always translating Dutch books in my head when I read them. So why not exercise that muscle? But then from my first class at my MFA, it was really mind-blowing. It really made me rethink the creative aspect of translation. I was being exposed to all these translation theories, but also all these incredible translators working to and from all kinds of languages. And I had a mind-blowing professor who really just helped me fall in love with translation. And from there, I started translating poetry throughout my MFA. And by the end of the 2-year program, I kind of had put fiction completely to the side and really just knew that I wanted to translate. I still write a little and get, inspired to write, but I'm never as enthusiastic as I am writing as I am when I'm translating. Translation, something clicked and yeah, it found me. So after I graduated, I started freelancing and I was doing a lot of non-literary translations, but doing my literary translation on the side. And slowly I started publishing. And well, here we are today. It's my full-time job.
And is there a translation that you have enjoyed the most or something that stayed with you particularly?
Yeah. There's something wonderful about all of the literary translations I've done. I really look for my connection to any text that I translate. But I would say the one that I've enjoyed the most, that is the most special to me, would have to be Jente Postuma's What I'd Rather Not Think About, because that was a real passion project. I picked that book up and I knew it was something that I really wanted to bring into English. And I pursued Jente and her publisher, and Jente and I worked quite closely on it together. And this year we were shortlisted for the International Booker Prize together. And just to go through that entire journey with Jente was incredibly special to me. We have a really special bond. And for that reason, I would say that's probably the translation that I've enjoyed the most, of the entire process of it from start to where we are today.
Mhm. And you mentioned that I think in some of the interviews you mentioned that you started this translation almost by yourself, that you picked up the book and just
Mm-hmm.
translated a sample for publishers, and
Mm-hmm.
that I got picked up. And is that something you do more often with books, or was this
Both. I think I now publishers come to me more often but I have projects that I'm really, sometimes I read something and I think, no, well, this is it. I think it's going to work. And I felt that way when I started translating Lucas Reinefeld's poetry right at the beginning of his career. And I think because I'm in the lucky position of having lived in Europe, Australia, and America, that I have a really good insight and I keep a really close eye on what is working in each of those industries in terms of who is publishing what readers are really resonating with. And I think that that really helps me while I'm reading potential books to translate, to understand not only what I like, but what I think will work in any market.
And if you had to choose, as far as you can, what is your favorite part of translation? What's the thing that excites you the most about it?
Most of it. But I would have to say probably the part that most people don't think about when they think of translation. It is the research aspect of it. And I spend a lot of time researching all kinds of things. The tabs that are open on my computer every day, I think the FBI would have a field day with, because there's so many crazy rabbit holes that I get to go down, and I learn so much every single day just because I fact check if there are things that I don't understand, or things that histories or cultural aspects I haven't heard of before. Or if I just want to learn more about them, I follow that research every day. And that's probably the most exciting part of my job. But there's also something really wonderful about the moment when you've been struggling with a phrase or a sentence for so long and it finally clicks, and there's nothing that beats that feeling either.
That sounds indeed like a great moment. I mean, I'm a researcher, but I also always love researching the little things.
Yeah.
But then towards the other side of this, what are, do you think, the main difficulties of translating or that you have encountered while translating?
Um, the main difficulties. Well, I would say some of the most challenging parts of translation is mainly dealing with people who don't understand or value a translation and really don't understand the work that we as translators do, how much time things take, and people who speak good English, but maybe not to the level that you would want for a literary translation. So I encounter that a lot because I deal with Dutch, and Dutch people are generally really, really good in English. They're fluent speakers, but I actually spend most of my time saying, no, that's actually not grammatically correct. Or people said that 30 years ago, but they absolutely wouldn't say it now. And I would say that's the most challenging part because I'm quite a conflict averse person. But sometimes I really have to stand my ground. And I think at the beginning of my career, I found that really hard to do. And now I think, well, it's part of my job. I don't love it, but I know it's best for the translation. I'm going to listen to the people I respect and admire, and perhaps drown out the rest of the noise and find diplomatic ways to say, hey, let me do my job. I chose this for a reason. Which is not to say that I don't like criticism. I really do welcome it. I think that's an important part of any translator's process. But I think it's important to also know who your best readers are, whether you're a writer, whether you're a translator, or any creative person working in your field. You have to know which voices to amplify and which voices to just say, okay, you can feel what you want, but I know I'm right.
And is it also sometimes interesting to have these kinds of discussion? Because I read somewhere that with What I'd Rather Not Think About, you and Jente had this discussion about interpunction, about question marks and commas, because that's
Yeah.
less common in Dutch than it is in English.
Yeah, definitely. And Yenta has a very interesting approach. She doesn't like a lot of punctuation. She's not a fan of the exclamation mark or the question mark. And We had a lot of conversations about that. And that's interesting. That kind of thing. I mean, that's Yente's work. I'll listen to anything she has to say or anything she wants to change. And I think we've worked so well together that, and so long together now, it's not the only thing that we've done together, that we generally understand each other's approach and can find a compromise. But yes, in the beginning, when I started working on What I'd Rather Not Think About, we had some very lengthy conversations about punctuation. But it was good because it was in many ways also a good way to see how far I could push English and how far we could go to meet in the middle to respect Yente's initial wishes and which things would just get in the way for the reader's experience. It's important to strike that balance.
Yeah, I can imagine. And because you also mentioned that you really are interested in kind of the use of language and kind of the different Englishes and the different kind of language uses that there are. And then I read What I'd Rather Not Think About. And I really felt that there was, because it's a very typical narrative voice that's there. It's very modern, but also it's a very, of course, depressing book. I mean, it's about the suicide of a twin brother, but at the same time, it's pretty light. It doesn't really delve into those deep, deep feelings on the page.
Mm-mm. No, Yente's a master at leaving space around her words, and a lot happens in that space to push the narrative forward, if that makes sense to you. It's as much about what is unsaid and the awkward silences as it is about the actual dialogue. But sorry, I forgot the question.
I think there also wasn't really a question in there, but I was wondering,
okay.
so what was the question I had? So you have this focus on language, really,
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
different kind of Englishes that are there. And I was wondering where both that kind of comes from and how you deal with that also in your translation, and perhaps how you find that in other translations as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think my interest comes from the fact that I'm an Australian. And, when I was growing up, you were supposed to aspire to having an accent and a way of speaking that was as close to British English or the Queen's English as possible. And that's what I was taught at my school. And, it was considered a compliment if you didn't sound Australian. And I didn't really think about that till I moved out of Australia to Europe. And, I was still quite young and people would comment on my accent all the time, or I had to change the way I spoke English sometimes just so that Europeans could understand me before I learned Dutch. And I started thinking a lot more about the validity of various Englishes, what is right and what is wrong, but also about the differences in our, for example, sense of humor or the way sarcasm is used, or even the generational differences. That's something that I really come across a lot when I'm translating, is that sometimes you'll see people translating someone who's quite young and they're using slang from, I don't know, back in the day. And I think, oh, that's a bit strange. Or vice versa as well. Younger people translating someone who's 60 and thinking that is not something that would be said. So I do a lot of research at the beginning, really trying to think about, okay, if this person is speaking English, and of course I'm asked generally to translate into either British English or American English, but there's so many ways of expressing British English or American English. So where would this narrative voice be on that scale? What would they say when they were trying to be funny or angry, or would they speak quickly? Would they speak slowly? And I think what I saw in Yente's book when I first picked it up, What I'd Rather Not Think About, is that there were a lot of parallels with a lot of the books that were being published by women around the same age as Yente, or a little younger, sort of that Generation X, elder millennial voice, kind of deadpan, but funny. And it's a new kind of humor. You see it in Ottessa Moshfegh's work. You see it especially in Halle Butler's work. I think that's a really good example of that kind of English and how it works and that kind of narrative voice. So yeah, I just find that really fascinating. And it's kind of my area of interest as a translator. I mean, we're all excited to be working with language, and what better than to really delve into these kind of things. I learn every day and it's so amazing. I can even source force kind of languages on social media. How are 16-year-olds speaking in Northern England at the moment? It's a wonderful tool to use, the internet, for that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned using the internet in a way to kind of access these different language uses and different kind of styles and registers.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other tools that you use to translate?
Yeah, I use the dictionaries. I use all of them because I love to cross-reference, and it also depends on which English I'm working with. I'll use the Cambridge Dictionary or Merriam-Webster or the Macquarie if I'm doing Australian anything, and thesauruses. And I usually have several of them open at any one time so I can sort of cross-reference and check things. And I also use some translation technology like Reverso or Lingui. Is that how you pronounce it, by the way? I've never really thought about it, but I'm really careful with them because I usually only use those as a way of seeing how far I can push a synonym, if there's any precedent on the internet for a synonym I want to use. But I'm constantly reminded how flawed these tools are because when I look at the actual translations in context, there's a lot of mistakes. There's a lot that's wrong. So, I'm always very careful. I wouldn't rely on that for anything more than a word or as kind of like a basic generative tool, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. And if there's a new technology or a new tool you could develop or imagine there to be, what would your like ideal technology/tool be?
I'm pretty old school. I have to say, I think I'm quite satisfied with what I use now. And I don't think I would want to develop a new tool. I know that things are going to change. I know that new tools are going to be developed and put on the market, but I don't think I need another tool. I think I'm even pretty lucky compared to 10 years ago with what we had at our disposal in terms of tools that we could use or AI that we could use in our profession.
Mm-hmm. But as you mentioned, indeed, there are all these new technologies always
Mm-hmm.
cropping up.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, nowadays there is the new machine translations.
Mm.
And what do you think the impact of these new tools, these developments, and machine translation in particular are on translation and the industry at large?
Well, I think the impact of machine translation on translation and interpreting, I'm going to include interpreting,
Mm-hmm.
even though it's slightly different, but do you think that's important to discuss? It's quite significant. On one hand, it's amazing to have some of the tools at your disposal if you can look at them with a critical eye. And also, I think it's been really helpful for things like interpretation, people being able to communicate in ways that they were never able to before. I think the technology has been amazing for that. But when it comes to translation itself, I would like to think that all people in the publishing industry and readers understand and value the work that translators do, but also recognize that these tools, even though they are increasingly more sophisticated, they are nowhere near advanced enough to be replacing people, real translators at this time. But unfortunately, it's not true that all people in the publishing industry or readers value what we do. I've been asked to edit machine translations. And to be frank, the one that I worked on was terrible, and I had to go back and retranslate everything. So it was kind of a pointless exercise. And the people asking me to do it somehow thought it was less work for me when it actually ended up being more. It was riddled with mistakes. And I think, yeah, it didn't really bear a lot of, it bore some resemblance to the original text, but it kind of went off in weird tangents. I think that people need to understand that machine translations at the moment, they kind of rely on averages. So they search and suggest a likely sequence of words, but none of that is cross-checked or fact-checked. And I think people know this, but I'm going to say it. Machines lack nuance. They don't recognize idioms. They struggle with slang. They can't read sarcasm, double entendres, and they also don't take into account things like continuity. And I think that all of these things combined can take a translation in some very weird directions. It's a bit like machine generated images. I think there are some really cool images being produced, right? Some of them are breathtakingly beautiful, but when you look at them, there's always something slightly off about it. And you can always tell immediately that you're looking at something that isn't authentic or real. And yeah, having machine generated translation or having a machine generated image and using that, and putting that on the market is a little bit like carrying around a really obviously fake Chanel bag or something. From a distance it might look like a real thing, but when you get close, it's really obviously a fake, and it's a little bit disappointing, and it makes people, I don't know, a little bit suspicious of you. And I really hope and I want to impress upon publishers that are, because I'm sure it's not editors making these decisions, people who really love books making these decisions, but people that are involved in asking writers or telling writers that AI translations are good enough to translate their work, that they understand what this looks like to people in the industry. It looks cheap, it looks thoughtless, and we're just not there yet.
And I think also for you as well, because you mentioned we discussed your interest in these Englishes and these differences, of course, before, and even better machine translations. I think what research has found is that they flatten out the text, like lexically, they become a lot less richer and you get this standardization. And you mentioned it a little bit already, but what do you think the influence of MT or even post editing on like the reader or viewer if you're talking about subtitles and stuff? But do you think the influence on the users of these translations will be if we switch or use more machine translation?
Yeah, I think people who are reading literature in translation are looking to disappear into a world. And if that world is uncomfortable because something is off about it, something feels off or it feels inauthentic, then I think readers will eventually turn away from translated literature. I think it's like, again, I'm going to come back to this like cheap copy thing. It's like if you buy a cheap copy knockoff of a designer item, it looks great, but it starts falling apart at the seams pretty quickly. And you wonder why you wasted your money in the first place. And I think readers are intelligent people. They're not looking to be duped. And I think that any publishing house that really thinks that it can sell readers AI machine translated books is really kidding themselves if they think that people aren't going to notice. Eventually it will affect the whole industry. I mean, why stop at translators? You could just replace authors. You could just have machines writing whole books. It's kind of baffling to me that we're developing all this technology to replace creatives and not to do mundane tasks. I mean, can't we replace the financial controller of a publishing house instead? Like the CFO? I don't know. I think that replacing creatives is never going to work entirely. People are craving human connection. I think it's exciting to have these new technologies at our fingertips, but I think of books, I think of writing like traveling in your mind or escaping into a world. And I don't think a machine can provide you with that kind of real human experience.
Yeah, I think it was one of the quotes we mentioned before in one of the podcasts is this idea of you want AI to do your dishes and your laundry, but you don't want AI to like take over your creative things. You want to do the fun things yourself.
Yeah, but I do want to point out that translation is fun. I love
Hmm.
it. I'm passionate about my job, but it is also a job
Hmm.
and it is my work. And if we're talking about replacing an entire, industry with machines, I mean, where does it stop? You're a researcher, you're doing
Hmm.
research. I mean, what's to stop researchers being replaced by machines from scraping stuff off the internet?
Hmm.
So yeah, I think on one hand, yes, it erases creativity because machines struggle to be creative, but also it's taking away jobs from real people. And that's an important aspect too.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention that on the podcast. But what you also mentioned was creativity. And this podcast is, of course, also about creativity. So I wonder, and this is a very broad question, but I was wondering for you, how do you define creativity in translation?
That's a really good question. I I think there's a lot of scope for creativity in translation. That's something that studying translation really taught me. I think being exposed to, especially people who are translating poetry, really allowed me to see how far you can push creative translation. And I'm thinking about people who translate poetry into another medium, for example, like Cecilia Vicuña with her Quipo poems, or Christian Hawkey, who in his book Ventricle, when he was translating Georg Trakel's work, did a lot of sort of homophonic and seance-like translations. I mean, these approaches are really out there, and these aren't techniques that I can apply when I'm, for example, translating fiction, but it does remind me to always play with the boundaries of what I'm doing. And even when I'm satisfied with something, to keep on playing. And I think maybe that's it. There's a playfulness or a play with words that I think you can always see when a translator is really invested in whatever it is they're translating, that they have really experimented, played around with words, and are looking at it through a creative lens. So I think it's a translator's willingness to experiment and play. That's how I would define creativity in translation.
I think that's a nice way of capturing it, actually. I think in general, creativity is so broad and so difficult also to capture or to define, which is
Yeah,
also why we asked this question, of course, because it's interesting to see how
yeah.
everyone looks at creativity. And
What
you
about
mentioned,
you
how would I
as a
define
reader? I'm
creativity?
curious. Yeah, I'm very interested how you would define it.
That's a difficult question indeed. I think creativity, well, in very general sense, it's about, well, this is the research part of me talking, the novel, and they tend to say novel and correct. So it has to be something new and it has to kind of make sense. And that latter part I always think is added when you look at machine translation, they just sometimes hallucinate stuff up. They make things that don't work, which
Yeah.
can't really be called creative in any sense. But for me, I think creativity is about, especially in translation, this, as you mentioned, this play with words, this kind of interaction between languages. There's not a direct forced link. You can't always translate one word directly with the other. I think in the podcast, someone else mentioned that translation is not about the words, but it's about the language, the story, kind of bringing across ideas. And I think creativity is the skill or perhaps even the tool you use to do that, to not just have this A is B, C is D, but to bring this across in a way that works, bring across both the same message and the same feeling. And that is very difficult. But I think to grapple with that and find solutions, that is creativity, at least in translation.
That's a good answer. And good to hear.
Yeah. And I was wondering because you mentioned that creativity in poetry can sometimes be very much pushed, and then sometimes with some of the fiction, it might be less so. Is your creative process or your creativity, does it feel the same in that sense when you translate poetry versus prose text?
Actually, I think it has more to do with the fact if I'm doing it for fun, for me, for my own creativity, or if I'm contracted to do something. I mean, I try to infuse any of the work I do with creativity, obviously. But yeah, it really depends. I try to carve out space for me to play around with texts just purely for my own pleasure. Some of them will never see the light of day. In fact, I hope they don't. But it does keep that muscle, that creative out there muscle flexing. And I do find that that influences my work. I have a bit of a process when I'm working. First, I never agree to translate anything until I have read it in its entirety. And then I take some time to kind of really understand my connection to a text. You know, where is the link between me and this text? So, how am I going to approach it? And then I'll start with my research. I'll research any cultural or historical elements. If the text references any literature, I will read it. If it's talking about film or television, I will watch it, or music, I'll listen to it. And I'll even sometimes ask writers if I have contact with them while I'm translating. That's not always the case, but it is my preference. I'll ask them if they listened to any music while they were writing the book. So I can kind of try and get into their head, their space, their kind of intangible feeling. And then I start looking for the right narrative voice. And only then do I start translating. But I'm always searching for alternative translations. Even when I'm fully satisfied with something, I want to keep playing around with it. And I also act out my translations, especially dialogue, because I find that that really helps me produce natural dialogue. And as I said, I'm really, really lucky. I live now in the US, in New York, and, having lived in Australia and Europe, I can play around with the accents and like the kind of ways that people speak and help me try and find a natural way for the narrative voice or the voices on the page to say whatever it is they need to say.
The process for you sounded very interesting and also very almost percolating aspects of some creativity to have it like sit with you and make it your own in that sense, to really have a feel for the text. And I always think that shines through in translation as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you've got to find a connection because it does shine through. You can see it, the reader can. I mean, this is what separates us from the machines, right? That human connection.
And as almost a final question, I was wondering in general, or for you, what makes a translation outstanding, both to read and perhaps to do?
What makes any translation outstanding is probably that the translation drips with the translator's passion for whatever project they're translating. I think you can, as I said, I think you can always read in a piece if the translator is really invested in their work and that they relish playing around in their target language, that they found the right voice and that voice really rings true. And it's kind of like they struck gold. I think it's also when I find myself reading something and thinking on a sentence level, that is a beautiful line over and over again, when there's just a rhythm that really mirrors the original language. And even if I don't speak the original language, there is a rhythm that feels very true to the narrative. So it just flows. And I also actually really love it. And I can pay attention to this when the original text is Dutch, but I kind of actually love it when translators pay attention to the sound of the original and then find little ways to try and replicate that in their translation. I think those are the things that I would look for in a translation that make it truly outstanding.
Yeah, that sounds great indeed. And those are, I think, the great parts about translation in general. And I said final question, but this is actually my final question.
Oh, okay.
Because you mentioned, I think it was in the interview that you did for the Booker Prize when you were
Mhm.
shortlisted. You mentioned that the value of translation is promoting a more inclusive and diverse literary canon. And I was wondering to what degree you think translation can indeed do this, and do we need to change anything about how translation is viewed to achieve this?
Yes, it's very important. I do think for many years a certain demographic was kind of overrepresented in the world of fiction. And I do look at my role as a translator as a kind of curator of work from one language to another. And by that, I mean, I want to represent in my work all of the Netherlands. I want it to be reflective of Dutch language as a whole and every corner and every kind of speaker of Dutch language. That's what I aspire to do. And I want, it's not always possible to only do the work that you want to do, but we all have our passion projects. And I think you can use that to show a true picture of what your language really is. And I think as a whole, any literary canon is more exciting the more diverse it is. We don't ever want to have just a one note archive. That would make life very boring. It's not just about fairness, but personally, I find it boring if you're kind of getting the same perspective and the same language over and over and over again. So, yeah, I do think that translation helps that. I do think translators from many languages doing that kind of work. And I find that really exciting. And I learn from translators from other languages how they're doing that. And I try to implement it in the work that I do as well. I kind of think of myself as a sharer of a language's secrets, if that makes sense, as a translator. And there's often a cliched or stereotypical version of a language presented in mainstream media. And I think through translation, we're able to give not only a bigger picture, but also share the secrets, especially for smaller languages, maybe even the less desirable sides of a language, which generally don't get presented in the mainstream media. And I think that that's kind of an exciting thing to be doing for work. Yeah. I encourage more translators to think about their work like that. And I think they already are in general. But yeah, obviously showing how diverse language can be not only benefits readers, but I think it benefits the industry as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful note to end on. Very well said. So thanks again for being here and talking to us about translation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Great questions. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you again to our invited speaker, and to our listeners. Thank you for being there, and feel free to share our podcasts with your family, friends, and colleagues. This is part of a series of podcasts of the EU-funded INCREC project. So follow us for more episodes, and please share your comments on this platform. See you next time.